Security panel, so we're about to start, and just right before we start, we really want to thank one of our sponsors, our internet sponsors, for helping out. Connecting. So far, this 5 days, there was no issue whatsoever. So here we go, in Mandarin though. 这个 panel 呢由可立可赞助，然后企业成长过程中资讯方面的挑战无所不在。从初创阶段，因缺乏专业 IT 与 MIS 人员，企业主往往苦于搭建稳定的网络基础架构，到中期阶段，随着团队协作和装置管理需求的增加，高效率和协作成为关键课题。在高速成长期，企业需要符合更严格的合规要求。 包括保护公司数据和资讯安全，以利筹备上市与面向大市场等。作为企业顾问，可立可深刻了解企业各阶段所面临的挑战，透过深入的需求分析和访谈，提供全方位的连结、协作和合规三大面向的服务，就能企业实现成长目标。Anyways, the internet is good. That's a really good thing. Like during the hackathon, so many people hacking here. That's the best. I would say that's actually the best thing. So, back to our security panel. So, hello everyone, and I'm Natalie. I'm one of the co-organizers of eType A, and also a security auditor by trade, currently serving at Quantstamp. And today we actually have a really great lineup with us today. Maybe, joining with me, we have Natalie Chen, Neville, and Richard, and Hiccup, and Trebien. So actually, let's just do a self-introduction and how you got into the Web3 security space, to kick us off.
Hey everyone, I'm Nat. I'm a security engineer at Trebien. I got into blockchain back in 2017 at ETH Waterloo. I started going to hackathons when I was in school, just kind of stuck with like blockchain development, and I switched into like the security side in 2020 when I joined Trebien.
Hello, I'm Neville. I'm a co-founder of Dedaub. I used to be an academic researcher, theoretical computer science, program analysis, and compilers. In 2018, I shifted my research onto smart contract security, where I was applying my techniques there. So that got me into this space. And then I was more and more interested in, the security space as we went along, created products, and then started an audit company called Dedaub.
All right. Oh, wait, there we go. All right, hey everyone, I'm Richard Ma. I'm the CEO and founder of Quantstamp. Started the company 5.5 years ago. And before I started Quantstamp, I was a quant at a hedge fund. I invested in Ether pretty early, and I was an investor in the original DAO. And so after the DAO hack, decided to start Quantstamp.
Test. Hi everyone, I'm Hiccup. I started off as a developer with Kyber in 2018. Then I swapped to Web3 security in middle of 2021. So I currently am a C4 warden / judge. I'm also with Sherlock and Spearbit DAO.
Hi, I'm Trey. So I lead bookings at Code Arena. I spent about 10 years in Web2 before I sort of fell into the crypto rabbit hole. And then my storied accomplishments in the first 2 years include getting rug, buying high, selling low, all of these mistakes, clicking on phishing links. And then at some point, I got really interested into the security behind all this, a lot of scam projects. And kind of stumbled my way into Code Arena. And so I'm relatively kind of new student security in this security space in Web3, about 2 years, yeah.
Cool. And so, since the DAO and then like DeFi boom, like millions and billions has been hacked. And so, obviously like auditing is quite important in the space. I guess But there's like one thing I think that is like developers might really want to know and get more clarity on. And so as auditors, we're also pretty just familiar with our own audited processes, but maybe we can like talk about that, how our auditing works in general. And then I'm also sure that like the traditional auditing is a bit different from the currently like community auditing. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So in terms of process, at Trilobits, we generally start with usually static analysis and kind of running tools like Slither on contracts just to get an idea of kind of low-hanging fruit in just like code, and so we can get a chance to basically focus on kind of the fun bugs and focus on like the ones that are like more complicated. So with static analysis, we can pretty much get kind of that like low-hanging fruit, and then usually I go into like manual analysis with kind of a focus on like looking for invariants. And then there's not really like a clear time in which I stop looking for invariants and start implementing them. Sometimes I just kind of bounce between the two. And kind of knowledge that you gain from like doing manual analysis on your code base, and then just time to like set up something like Echidna on your code base can also kind of provide more context as to how your invariants are expected to work, and then it's just an iterative process, I think, from then on.
At Dedaub, the process is actually very similar to what Natalie explained. So we also use static program analysis tools. We don't use Slither. We use Watchdog, which is our own tool. And the process actually starts, I believe, before the audit. So we try to make sure that the project is actually ready to be audited. Sometimes we have to delay the audit process because the business development guy that we're speaking to is very keen on getting the audit done and dusted. And sometimes developers haven't had the courage to communicate that they need, a couple of weeks more to test the protocol. We start off by, understanding the protocol itself. We read the documentations for the first day or so, and then the first phase of the audit mostly consists of getting a deep understanding of the protocol, such that, if we had to rewrite it from scratch, can we actually dump all the documentation and do it ourselves? So that you need that level of understanding. And then the second phase of the audit is to actually work like a hacker and actually, understand what assumptions the project has, what the invariants that project has, and whether you can break them in any possible way. We've got a lot of tricks. Right.
So, sorry, I actually want to like kind of follow up on that. So you touched on another perspective. So Natalie touched on like the technical perspective on the review, and you lightly touched on the like making sure that the documentation, like a pre-process. I think like maybe that's something that we can expand a bit more. Sure.
I mean, this process, evolved naturally as we had experience with auditing more and more projects. One of the things we do, we kind of understand whether this is the first audit of the project, because if it's the first audit of the project, having worked with auditors before, then, you gotta explain the process, more clearly. We send a document before the audit saying, this is, the level that your project should be, when starting the audit. Things like that.
And just to follow up on that, I think like for auditing, we try to be very collaborative. So, usually like for crypto projects, they don't have the best documentation because everybody's trying to, deploy things pretty quick. And so often when the projects come to us, we'll work with them to try to figure out, okay, exactly, how is the project meant to work, and do some calls with them. And then also internally for our own auditing team, we try to just focus on learning for the team and collaborating during the audit to find more complex vulnerabilities. So I think that's sort of like our main style, and it really works well over the longer time period because like, you know, every like 3 months or 4 months, there's something new that people invent in the Web3 space. And so like for auditors, like we're constantly learning about new projects and learning like how new things work. And it's like easier to learn as a team with like other smart people, and you can like ramp up faster. So I think that's sort of the approach.
Yeah, I can attest to that. So I've worked both individually as a warden in Code Arena and Sherlock. So I've also worked as a team with Spearbit. So I've seen how both like working solo and as a team both have their pros and cons. So let me talk about me individually as an auditor, what my process is like. Usually I start off by reading any documentation that is provided by the client. So it's for me to get a good understanding of, a rough understanding of how the project is supposed to work. And then after that, I would start with a shallow dive into the code base to understand the business logic, but of course not doing a deep dive yet. So it's mostly to try to understand the business model. Then after that, I do like a deep dive into the code base. With that, then as for Spearbit, I think it's something similar as well. Each team member tends to bring something different to the table. So like the one that I recently worked on, somebody was doing invariant testing, right? So others could just be doing manual reviews on the code base, and others could maybe try running like Slither, running automated tooling on the code base. So I think with Spearbit it was a little bit more collaborative, and we get to explore different paths.
I would say the process at Code Arena is perhaps a little bit simpler upfront. Basically, during the scoping process, we try to understand, of course, the scope of the audit, any complexity factors that might be at play here. Then, from that point onwards, it's really getting the repo up into shape for the success of the competition. We do lean quite a bit on the incentive design because with Code Arena, you basically sort of eat what you kill. So there's really no limit as to how much you can earn if you're good. I mean, the limit to the pot per competition, basically. So with the given context, many of these auditors who are either full-time auditors, full-time independent auditors, lead devs, they basically can take what's given to them in this initial phase and then basically go on from there. Okay, I mean, increasingly we're getting more teams of wardens competing as teams, precisely what Hiccup said, and they would basically divvy up the responsibilities or maybe vectors of attack between themselves in terms of competing, and then they would split up the rewards accordingly.
Cool. And so actually just kind of follow up on that. The scoping process in Code Arena, like who does it? So I would say like probably in the traditional audit firm that I know is like, well, we have try to have an auditor like go on and scope, and so how does the Code Arena, like the community effort, does that?
So the question is, how does the community partake in the scoping process?
Yeah, that's correct.
So it's largely, I would say, maybe still 70–80% internally decided, and we basically have a system where there are complexity strikes. So we have a scoping form that has about maybe 20–22 questions, something like that. And depending on the answers that are given in each parameters, there will be there's a complexity strikes that's added to it. And based on that, how we typically scope and advise bounty sizes or award pools for projects is, for this scope, historically, this is the award pool that we set. If there are certain complexity strikes that are occurring above a certain number, we would advise that, hey, you probably should think about boosting the pool a little bit to further incentivize the wardens. In terms of involving the community members, we do have like a team of, let's say, pretty active community base of members that I or some other team members might personally talk to them when some questions about scoping arises. Then I might get, let's say, 5 different opinions to kind of triage on something as a baseline.
Makes sense. Thank you. So then I guess follow up on that. So Hiccup, you have been involved in like both, right? And so how would you say like the difference between these community effort and then like individual ones?
Yeah, okay. First off, I think one key difference is the incentive structure, right? With traditional audit firms, you get a fixed pay. But with audit contests, your payout is determined by the number of bugs and the severity of the bugs you find. So with that, I think there is, in a way, different behavior. With a fixed pay, of course, you would still try to do your best, right? But there is a bit more of a level of competitiveness when it comes to audit contests. So I think it does, there is sort of like a game theory to it with the audit contests, audit competitions that you probably don't see as much with traditional audits. I think the other part of it is with audit contests, you have basically anybody can jump in, right? Because for Code Arena anybody, you could have no prior experience at all, and you could just like take a look at the repo if it's a public contest, and from there then you could just start auditing, and it's flexible enough for you to not even have to it's up to you to decide how long you want to spend on the code base. It could be say 15 minutes, half an hour, one full day, right? And I mean, you don't really have to find all the bugs, but you can tailor it to your schedule based on your own like lifestyle, right? And with that, with it being so open, then it caters to a wide variety of, in a sense, auditors, right? You have people who will be like hardcore, going hard at it, to them it's like a full-time job. And on the other spectrum, you have people who kind of like do it more as a hobby, to be exposed to new code bases, to new features that they might not be aware of, or to keep in touch with the latest developing practices. So yeah, I would say like these are the two main differences that I see between community style audits and traditional audits.
Yeah, I guess to add on to that, I have a bunch of the Arena tokens, and I think Code Arena and like things like Code Arena, it's a really good way to onboard more people into auditing, because it's it's like has a very high barrier to entry as a profession, and most people they don't teach security auditing in university, so the funnel into being a great auditor is like very tight, and then the great thing I think also about Code Arena is that you can get exposed to a whole bunch of different projects, right? Because there's various contexts happening. So yeah, that's what I would say for it. And then I think for traditional audits, it's more collaborative, in the longer sense, where you have people that and that are all very smart and nice and that have worked together for longer. And so it's more just like a a team exercise where everybody's skill level, and there's in some sense I think some level of competition is healthy, but you don't want too much competition, because especially for the really complicated projects, it's kind of a team effort to find those more complex bugs, right? So you don't want people to withhold information, or withhold, they might think they have suspicion about some part where it feels weird and they want to look more into it. So that's sort of where I think is kind of the trade-off there.
Thank you. Well, if I could add something, the community approach obviously has a lot of pros as well, also cons. So another con of that is that the process is a little bit inefficient. So you do get a lot of information, a lot of duplicates, whereas in an audit which is performed by say one or two people, it's going to be pretty concise. So yeah.
Yeah, I would just add that I think when you consider community audits, a lot of the focus is on bug finding, whereas I think there's another area that needs a lot of attention, which is usually related to like system design, how just recommendations around like simplification of your system or just high level like architecture, which I think is one aspect that may not be covered as much with community audits.
Cool. And so with that, so we have the developer perspective. I think Hiccup did touch on one thing, which is bug. We do sometimes miss bugs as auditors, and there's like a very common question, which is, well, when bugs are being missed, like who are responsible for it? So would like to take it.
The user, for sure. I can go. Yeah, I mean,
The government.
this is my personal opinion. I think generally, as our industry and the domain matures, even as an end user on both sides of the fence, I would like to see it trending and leaning towards more accountability. Right now, I feel like, I mean, it's really hard to say, right? Because now that I'm involved in security, for sure, when I'm putting money in a protocol, I want to understand like how they approach security in general. And also, I think many times, sometimes some questionable protocols, which I should not be named, they would just do an audit to get their brand, to get the brand out there. But actually the scope of the audit is much smaller than, what is that? But most of us who are not technical have no capability of understanding that. So I think greater transparency leaning towards that on all the parties involved definitely helps as well,
I would say I wouldn't really want to do finger pointing. I think sometimes as an auditor, like I sometimes ask myself, right, like for the projects that I've audited, are there any bugs that I've missed, right? And there's always that possibility. So I think it did happen to a notable like warden with the Euler finance hack, right? So they were auditing like an update to the code base, but then sometimes it's because you're only given that scope, right? And you don't have the full picture of the code base. So then it could be probable that you miss something that is a system-wide level attack. But it's because you were only like asked to look at specific contracts, right? But then sometimes I feel like if I were in that situation, it would eat at me. I might not be able to sleep well. So in some sense, I do feel like the auditors who were involved in auditing that project would feel like they are responsible for it. At the same time, it's also the projects themselves. I think like I've been in the shoes of a developer, right? So if I were to write code that was hacked, it would be like, oh shit. And I would also feel responsible, right? So in general, I think it's not just one party. It will be whoever was involved in that process would bear some kind of responsibility. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess just to add to that, probably like every 2 weeks for the last 4 years, I've been having some calls with the founder or CTO of projects to try to get them to slow down on deploying stuff. And it just, it happens all the time. It happens especially during Christmas and New Year's because like, I don't know what the reason is, but people really fucking love to deploy stuff during Christmas and New Year's. And like January 2nd, and January 1st for some reason. So, like when we do audits, on the one hand, we serve the companies. And so, ultimately it's up to the company and how much budget they have and like when they decide they want to get an audit and what the scope is. And then on the other hand, like when we see, after we do the audit, we generally have a really good idea of what is the chance that this thing could get hacked in, the next year. And like often we might have, found all the significant bugs, But from looking at the way that they're doing development, we can tell like, okay, well, if you're not going to come back for another audit in the next 6 months, and based on the pace that you're doing stuff, looks pretty risky. And so often we have those calls, and I'll say about 70% of the time they don't really listen because nobody wants to slow down. They raised all this money from investors, and they got all these developers like pumping out stuff, and it's usually after the first time they get hacked that they really take it seriously. And unfortunately, for most projects, it's their first project. And so as a repeat player, I think one of the main responsibilities is to use as much of our soft skills as possible to try to convince people to slow down a bit.
Thank you. As to the question, who's responsible? Generally, it's more the project than the auditor. An auditor like us, for instance, we're very specialized on security. We're not an insurance company. We don't have actuarians. We don't model risk of hacks and things like that. And in addition to that, I would argue that there's no quantitative way to find out the risk of these hacks. If you look at Euler, for instance, they've gotten quite a few audits. 6 auditors, formal verification, but yet there was one missing detail, one function, and in combination with a lot of complex machinery that caused this to be hacked. So, yep.
Yeah, I think just to echo the sentiment, I think audits in general are not really meant to be, okay, you've passed the audit, now you can deploy. That's not really the purpose of the audit in the first place. The purpose of the audit is basically to tell you, within the amount of time that we had, these are the bugs that we found. And I think in terms of even just reading audit reports, the number of findings is definitely going to help with kind of providing context as to what the system looks like right now. But another area that is really valuable is what are things that in terms of development lifecycle that a protocol can take on to improve their security process. And more specifically, how can projects integrate something like static analysis or fuzzing into their CI so that when they get to the audit stage, we're not looking for, okay, here's output from static analysis and not necessarily having to report that. And we can focus on kind of more complex system interactions.
The perspective from the auditors, but still from the project side, I would say, now if audits are not to secure the project, how do we determine or assess the quality of an audit? Because oftentimes, when developers engage with audit firms, sometimes they just get a report, and a lot of questions. In private, I also get a lot of these kind of questions, how do we know is it a good audit or not? So, anyway, takers?
Yeah. So I oftentimes read audit reports by other auditors as well to learn about the audit process and also the quality of other auditors and what they're doing and the protocols they've audited, especially if we kind of have are auditing a protocol which is building on some other protocol. So the way my approach basically is to just first of all eliminate all the boilerplate, right? So go directly to the critical vulnerabilities and high severity vulnerabilities. Now what I do is I look at take a sample of these high severity and critical severity vulnerabilities, and sometimes I find something which is marked as high, and it's well, is that really a vulnerability? So that means that probably the auditor is not trying to find heavy stuff in the audit, and they're marking some vulnerability as a higher severity than they actually are. So there's some telltale signs like this that that I use in order to estimate the quality of the audit. Well, the other thing is that there's some audit firms that have different skill sets in their auditing team, and sometimes you find, extremely good audit report, and then, less, high quality audit report for the same brand. So that's because, they've got many people with different skill sets.
I think in addition to just looking at, there's a lot of information that you can find when you're reading, like finding descriptions and kind of gathering like how things could be exploited. Another thing I generally look out for is just again, system level recommendations around kind of whether the reviewer has kind of thought about the system as a whole. What are potential exploits that might occur when like the protocol interacts with another external third party, and kind of being able to kind of holistically look at the system in addition to the findings themselves.
Yeah, and I think like another just like follow-on point is, if you're a developer and let's say you're getting audit and you don't know if it's good audit or not, a really good way to tell is like, what questions are the auditing firm asking you, and are they good questions? Because I think you can tell a lot if like let's say you give your code base to an auditing firm and then they like disappear for 2 weeks and then they come back and they give you a report. Most likely that's not going to be a great report, and the reason is you're always going to understand your project better than the auditing firm. And so if the people who work at the auditing firm really care about doing this right, they're going to be asking you questions like, every day, every other day, and they're going to be like good questions that are going to make you think a little bit before you answer. And so that's like a really good sign. And then, having a very well written report that's like thoughtful and not just misranking some things as more serious, right? So.
Yeah, I guess to add on, it's really about communication. So, how much has the auditor communicated with you during the audit? But of course, that's during the audit, right? So, if you want to find out, like you've never engaged that auditor before, you can, number one, read past reports that they've written and try to get a sense of the vulnerabilities that were found, right? Is it something that could be picked up with static analysis only? Or do they like really try their best to explain, maybe they try to explain the system, the business logic in the report, or maybe they could say explain like what the centralization risks are, right? So I think that one way to measure is the comprehensiveness of the report, of past reports that they've written. Yeah, so there are many ways to measure an auditor's like ability in that sense.
What Hiccup said. I think on a high level, as a non-technical person, the breadth and depth is what I look for. So for sure, I think traditional audits and all these other folks on the stage has a complementary approach to a C4. As much as I like C4, I don't think it should be the end all and be all when it comes to security. And I think having objectivity with working with different firms, different approaches to make sure that you basically cover a depth of scope, that would be a signal of like a company taking security seriously rather than just going for one option. Yeah.
Yeah, so on this line, I think like community style audits are a bit different. So I like to ask this, like, have you noticed like different sort of quality, or do you measure quality within, like, let's say Code Arena audits? Does that make sense? Like during different audits of Code Arena, because it's always open to different people, have you noticed like different audit quality as a result, like the final report?
Yeah, so we have maybe over 3,000 registered wardens, which are what we call auditors now. And what I know, also by speaking to wardens like Hiccup, is that different people show up for different competitions. And this can be both based on, let's say, availability, they have full-time jobs perhaps, also based on interest. So some of the auditors, the more senior ones, they are like, I don't want to do NFT stuff, for example. They only want to do novel math stuff. So you have different sets of people showing up for different competition, and that problem kind of takes care of itself, partly because of the incentive design, as well as right now we have about 80 to 100 auditors per competition. So when you spread out across that kind of number, that quality itself has been taken care of in so far. Yeah.
Cool. And an earlier thread that we sort of touch upon is the difficulty of fixed reviews, right? Like fixed reviews, like Hiccup said, like it was extremely difficult because if you're only looking at like a specific code at one scope, you might miss like systematic bugs. So I was wondering like how everyone like deals with diff audits or like these kind of stuff. So any takers? Go for it.
Okay, yeah, sure. So with diff audits, I think there is definitely an advantage if you've audited that particular code base before. So like maybe the V1, right? And they're adding something on top of V1. So having that prior knowledge definitely gives you an advantage, and it kind of allows you already to have like a good understanding of the whole system. So then the chances of you missing like with more context, it allows you to find like that specific business specific bug, right? As opposed to somebody like a fresh pair of eyes that has never seen your code base before, and they're just looking solely at that particular part of your code base, right? So there's definitely an advantage if you have at least worked with the entire code base in that sense. Yeah.
I think specifically for fixed reviews, another thing that the problem that I think arises from this like very small scope of code that you're looking at in terms of like fixes is similar to a problem that arises with like very limited coverage audits as well, because in both cases you essentially need to isolate a very small subset of your system and be able to test it or check it based on those assumptions. And I think with fixed reviews, as like a security researcher, you also have to keep in mind that you're not necessarily like you're reviewing the changes with respect to like that specific scope and not necessarily potential upstream changes or downstream changes. So I think being very specific about what conditions you've actually like tested and checked those fixes is really important, as well as just making sure that like any assumptions that you're making are as explicit as possible.
So, on a technical level, one of the things that helps auditing, fixed reviews is AST diffing tools. So if there's like, changes to the, spacing or, the formatting of the code, that sort of stuff, it doesn't get picked out. So that's one thing. A variation of fixed reviews, sometimes a lot of people, come to us and say, well, we're forking this protocol and we're forking it in this way, right? Now, the way that we address, audits for those is, sometimes or, half of the times we avoid them, right? Unless we've actually audited the original protocol, and in that case, we would go to try to get the same team of auditors who audited that protocol to audit the fork. Now, there's exceptions to that. There's some other protocols that we, intimately have knowledge of, like things like Curve, Aave, and things like that. So for those kinds of things, we also accept to do.
Cool. So kind of moving forward, think like in the beginning we said like, oh, you know, when a project gets hacked, like, oh, who's responsible? You said user. Trebien said user. Well, that's actually something, you know, maybe an interesting topic, because when this is happening, like we never talk about like the user responsibility and all that. And so like one aspect maybe is what does like what can a user do to kind of like improve the security of the space? Not necessarily the project or you know, like the auditing process, but like just a normal user. How can they contribute to security?
Revoke approvals.
Probably like don't ape into so many things, because you know, starting from DeFi Summer, I think basically all the like animals that exist like in the world have been used up, and most of the food groups, food things, and so like a lot of those, I feel like, you know, if you're not a security expert and you see you know Nigiri DeFi protocol, like probably don't put your money in there even if they're promising like 100% APY. And that would actually like help a lot with the dynamics. I think in the current bear market, that sort of like happened in a very like natural selection manner, because you know, recently I think most of the food group type of projects have kind of gone to zero. So, you know, just like next bull market, like don't do the same thing, even if now they've switched from animals and food to some other naming convention.
I have to agree. So use a bit of common sense. Don't put 100% into one project, and especially if it's a very new project. So I do recommend spreading your funds, whether it's across multiple wallets or putting it into multiple projects, right? And also, I would say, if you are able to, for the more technical people, you can take a look at the audit report to see what kind of vulnerabilities are found. So then you have like a sort of like a slightly better understanding of the development process that was like.
So spread your funds across different food projects, right? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, like I hope one day this when token meme can become when audit or when security. I doubt we will see that, but let's see. I think beyond the whole private key stuff, for sure getting a basic understanding of like audits and what they do, how they relate in a Web3 space when the table stakes are so high is critical. As an end user, again, I think these days, if I'm interested in any project, I would definitely be asking questions about how they are approaching security and what measures they have taken. That's, for me, is a very clear sign of them putting their money where their mouth is.
Verify before you sign. I think that's, well, one aspect. The other one, I would actually argue that for audit reports, you don't necessarily need to be technical to actually read them. I think if you just go into, like, for example, like a detailed finding, you can actually skip right to like an exploit scenario, so that you can actually see how can something be exploited without actually understanding what your source code does. I think is one thing that is useful as well.
Cool. And on the perspective of moving forward, what kind of changes would you like to foresee in the auditing industry, like let's say the next 2 years or so?
Better tooling. I think just putting more time into like reviewing, kind of pausing, or not necessarily developing as quickly, putting more time into making sure that static analysis is integrated in all of your code, so that you're actually checking and that you can essentially find bugs while you're developing instead of waiting for an audit, and better unit testing and fuzzing as well.
So as an auditor, I'd argue like to understand, to put it back into the development process. You know, when you're developing the protocol, you're like, well, if I develop the protocol in, in this way, if I develop this algorithm in this way, will it be auditable, right? So there's a few tricks you can do to make the protocol more auditable. You know, like for instance, naming the variables in appropriate ways, removing certain features which are going to be extremely hard to audit. Comments, invariants, like adding, for instance, checks that, all right, they might waste a little bit of gas, but then the auditor is assured that certain execution will not happen. So then the complexity in your mind when you're looking at the smart contract is reduced, and a host of other things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, like with the rise of L2s, one thing I hope to see a bit less is these like crazy gas optimizations. So for some of the projects we've done, it's like gotten maybe like 4 times harder because the developer just happens to be extremely good at optimizing for gas and writing an assembly. And so, I think like with more L2s taking off, that's gonna have less of a priority for the projects, and like focusing on understanding. And like often we also see like the internal team, not everyone on the projects team really like fully understands like the project of their architectural decisions, and like they might have somebody that's just like trying to optimize for gas, but other people don't understand what they're doing. And that's like really hard when they bring that to an auditor. So I hope like I think we'll see less of that as like the L2s help with scaling.
Yeah, I would like to add to that. So one contest like OpenSea, right? They were working on CPOD with regards to writing assembly code. I think one nice practice that they did was to provide a reference contract that wasn't written in assembly. So it's like a side-by-side comparison. One version was in assembly, the other was in normal like non-assembly code. So you could do like a line-by-line comparison. And from there you kind of have an expectation versus reality comparison, right? So I hope that's something that developers who are writing in assembly would adopt. I think the other thing that, another security practice that I would like to see more adoption of is the hiring of, say, security consultants. So the idea is to get a security-minded person onboarded even before you start, when you are from the very start of the project. So, for example, like these technical people, like maybe you're new to Solidity, right? So you're unaware of the best practices, you're unaware of what libraries could be used, or you're unsure of what existing code base you could say, in a sense, copy from, right? So it's good to have somebody who is already familiar with these libraries to kind of advise you to the best path forward. So like you don't really want to write your own ERC20 from scratch, right? You could just use Soulmate or ERC or OpenZeppelin's version, for instance.
To add on what Nat said, so probably better tooling and standardization. Also, I guess everyone's talking about AI, so it remains to be seen what the impact, but I'm sure it will be more pronounced over time. Yeah.
Yeah, just one thing to add around having, with like gas optimizations and having the reference implementation, gives developers just this amazing breadth of opportunity where you can go through with manual review and potentially compare 2 different functional implementations. Then there's also the possibility of using code analysis and something like program analysis in order to compare output of like a high-level reference in Solidity versus whether the gas optimized version actually behaves in the same way. and kind of exploring that area in more depth is an interesting area as well, because it becomes very clear where functions might deviate.
Awesome. So now I'm going to select 2 questions from Discord. Let me see, 1 sec. Cool. So this is from Anton. Can you share some projects you remember specifically that have good pattern, test, coding style, so we can learn from what it's like clean and secure? Yeah. Can you share some projects that you remember specifically that has good pattern, test, or coding style, so that the devs can learn and what is clean and secure?
Oh, I can start. I think Compound is great. It's really clean, like battle tested. There's not really any extraneous stuff in there. Well commented. Every single update they do, it also goes through governance, and there's a whole bunch of reviews, which is probably as good as you can get that. And then also, like, because it's a mature project, the pace of updates is very slow, and so as far as like kind of a security person goes, that's about as good as you can get it, apart from like Uniswap.
So one project that impressed me in that aspect, is some of the Chainlink products. So, sometimes we get comments like, this, that this is secure because of that or that, they really make sure that the project is well auditable and that the auditors don't waste their time to, figure out what's going on.
As mentioned, Seaport, because of how they provided their reference implementation together with the gas optimized version. So that's one project that stood out. I think the other is actually Uniswap v3. I felt that their code base was rather clean. They had a very comprehensive test suite. Then there was one more. Okay, so recently I heard of Primitive Finance. I think they had some kind of sick tooling that was used. I saw a tweet somewhere. I don't really remember the specifics. It's something I have to look into.
Yeah, I would to say Primitive Finance as well. I think their first version was one of this. They integrated Echidna, and that integration was incredibly smooth because of the fact that they had thought about all of their invariants beforehand, so that by the time that they actually got into the opportunity to implement them, it was very clear what expected behavior was and what wasn't. And so that's one of the most important things when you're writing invariants, and having that list beforehand of just what's expected and what's not is going to be essentially one of the most important things.
To add something about Primitive Finance, so the developers evolved quite a bit. So if you look at their latest code, it is exactly as you say. You got to understand that they actually got a very big shock at some point, in Primitive V1, when we had find a exploitable vulnerability as white hat hackers, and those 3 to 4 days in a war room, figuring out how to get out of the situation, made a difference in their security.
Cool. The following question is from Shanti. For newly established projects, maybe from Hackathon, without a lot of funding to engage audit firm, what methods would you recommend to increase its security?
Use open source tooling to secure your software. Trailbits has a lot of external and open source tools that are available out of the box. Slithers provides static analysis, and that's something that you can run on pretty much any smart contract as long as it's EVM based. and just making sure that you're continuing to use these tools that are readily available as long as you're updating your code and even afterwards.
Like, try to not over-engineer your system. You know, keep it as simple as possible, and that'll help tremendously. And then, you know, yeah, I think that's my main tip.
I think having documentation early, it doesn't have to be in the form of like a documentation portal immediately, right? But I think as long as you have inline comments that are updated, that really goes a long way to people who will be reading your code.
So, if you use battle-tested code already, you know, like standard libraries, there's, you know, Open Zeppelin libraries, they're pretty good, for instance, and things like that. You know, don't over-optimize. Don't try to be, you know, super smart with your first implementation. Reduce the number of features, and then, of course, apart from the open source, you know, static analyzers, there's also like you know, cheap versions as well, like non-open source.
Yeah, I think working with good small independent auditors could be a good start because they tend to be in an affordable range. Also, possibly consider the route of getting grants. Because I know ecosystems are also offering grants to small projects, especially when it comes to, I mean, most ecosystems are interested in securing the security of the ecosystem. They don't want to get hacked, right? So that could be a way to go.
I personally just want to add tests. Like also understanding the quality of your tests, because test coverage is one thing. Recently there are some other tools called like mutation testing. That one is pretty cool. Like lets you, basically it changes like your code a little bit and to see whether your test kills the mutant. And that actually tells you like how good your test is, because in theory it should kill every mutant. So yeah. Cool. Let's perhaps go through one last questions. When you're about to start auditing contracts, what do you most appreciate the project team doing, and what do you least appreciate?
Well, kind of like parroting a little bit things that were said earlier. So mostly not appreciate if the project is really not ready to be audited. So one thing to keep in mind is, well, like if I had to point a gun to your head and say, well, is it ready to be deployed tomorrow? Are you sure it's going to break, you know, the first time it's going to be used? So, you know, functionally that it works, you know, it's well documented. When we see projects like that, we appreciate it. When we see projects that don't build, for instance, that's something that is very problematic.
One thing I least appreciate is projects just giving me the contracts only, no tests, nothing, just contracts for and, you know, you're supposed to do the setup yourself, and, you know, there's nothing to run with now. So yeah, that's not the way to go.
I think one of the misconceptions with audits is, again, that it is just a green check mark that you can just deploy right afterwards. I think when you're going through an audit, and especially when you're kind of interfacing with reviewers, the most important mindset is to be able to talk about your code openly and be able to take in that feedback, because the feedback is meant for you to essentially improve your code. If your project or if your development team is in a state where you're not ready for that feedback, then the audit may not be as productive as it could have been. And in terms of what helps and kind of what makes auditing kind of more efficient is really I think documentation and kind of as much context about the system as you would give like a developer that you're onboarding into your ecosystem, so that from an auditing perspective, at least we know how the protocol is expected to work in the first place.
Yeah, and just to add to that, like, yeah, I think communication, like, you know, well, I think, you know, the auditor is like where we care about your project. And so like, if we call you up and we're like, hey, probably don't deploy that yet, like maybe take that a bit seriously. And you know, whether that's like myself or like the, you know, the security researcher that you're working with. And then I would say, yeah, like during the audits, you know, if we say, hey, look, like you could use a few more tests here or like inline comments, probably it's not a good thing to just respond with, well, like the code is the documentation, but which I've heard like endless times over the last like 5.5 years. So yeah, you know, like often I think if it's your first time doing a project, you might feel like you got everything like pretty, like got all your ducks in a row, but the bar for having a project that is not hacked is actually really high. And if you look at most DeFi projects that have been around for a couple of years, there's very few that have not had an incident. And so if you just think about like probabilistically, you know, when you start a project, like you really want to try to like reduce the chance of that as much as possible. Right, so.
I'm actually surprised at the consensus of the answers given. So communication is definitely a big part. What Richard and Nat said, I think openness to receiving feedback and generally responsiveness for me is a big signal as to how interested the protocol is in the security. Least appreciated fact is probably someone who just wants to come in, get something done the quickest for the least amount of money, and they don't ask any questions, like Richard said. Generally, the people who are super responsive, they also tend to be the one who are really on point during onboarding. They do the right documentation. They're responding to us, responding to the wardens, to the community. So yeah, that would be it.
All right. With that, I'd like to conclude our security panel. And so thank you, panelists. Thank you, Natalie, Neville, Richard, Hiccup, and Trebien. Thank you.